Hey everyone, welcome to the Stash Bandit Studio. We have just a minute or two before we are going to start this morning's Facebook Live, and I thought I would just make sure my camera is positioned correctly and that when I move to the design board in a minute you'll be able to see, and give my coworkers a minute to share this to our other channels. So I wanted to talk to you just for a minute about what I'm working on. I wonder what you're working on. I hope you're finding lots of time to sew and get things done. I'm working on about 4 different things right now. I'm doing some machine applique on some old-fashioned blocks called oak leaf and reel. And I'm going to make 9 of those blocks, and then I'm going to use them as a way to demonstrate some of the machine quilting techniques that I've been practicing. Goodness, machine quilting, free motion quilting is not for the faint of heart, but I'm here to tell you the thing that makes the biggest difference is practice. If you can just practice 15 minutes a day, it really makes a difference. Then I'm working on a really fun sort of an art quilt that's called a sea glass quilt, and I found it on Instagram through a user. Her handle is Exhausted Octopus, and I think that's because she's a marine biologist, but these sea glass quilts are just easy and fun and beautiful. So I'm working on that. And then I'm super excited to be working on this Awash with color mystery sampler that we're going to be talking about today. So let me just check the time. 11:01. We're going to just wait a couple more minutes. I'm so glad to see that some of you are hopping on. My friend Tammy Jo that I went to church with years ago when I lived in Denver is on. I see someone from, is it really from Paris? My goodness, that's exciting. So love to have you here. If you want to give a little like or a thumbs up or whatever the icon is and say where you're from, that would always be a lot of fun. So I think it's time we can go ahead and start officially. Welcome to the Stash Bandit Studio. I'm Diane Harris, and I'm coming to you from rural Nebraska. I live in the middle of nowhere, and I love it here. No traffic, no noise, very few people, and lots of time to sew. Today we are going to be talking about block 1 of the Awash with Color mystery sampler. The patterns for this sampler are all online at no charge, so they're complimentary, and we'll put links up to those patterns. And today we are going to talk about block 1, which is a log cabin, and I'm going to tell you some of the tips and tricks I've learned about log cabin over the years. So just give me a second here, and I'm going to adjust the camera so that you can see the design board. And I decided to go scrappy with my sampler. The one that you'll see in the instructions is pink and blue. And if you decide you want to go with exactly what you see in the instructions, that's totally fine. But I decided to do mine scrappy because scrappy is kind of my thing. One thing I would point out here is you'll notice sort of a diagonal divide in this block. Traditionally, a log cabin block is light on one half and darker on the other half. And that division of lights and darks is what enables people to set log cabin blocks in so many different interesting ways. You hear about a setting called straight furrows or barn raising or streak of lightning, and those are all created because a block traditionally has that diagonal divide with lighter on one side and darker on the other. So this is one of the blocks I made along the way, and the next thing I want to show you is I noticed that in the instructions the first thing you see is a layout where they sort of look like stair steps, And I wanted to also show you this kind of a layout where you can see more the circular progression of how the logs are added. So generally you start with a square in the middle, and then you add one log to that, and then one more log here, another log here, and you progress around. And the progression I'm showing you today is counterclockwise, and you can certainly do it in a clockwise direction instead. But if you're making a quilt with a bunch of log cabin blocks, you need to make sure that they're all in the same direction, either all added counterclockwise or all added clockwise. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is in the instructions, you'll see that you're told to cut each of the logs to a specific length. And that is a really good thing to do and a very helpful way to practice your piecing, because it keeps you honest with every single addition. You start with the center, you add one log, well then right away this next log has to fit these two together. So you know right off the bat when you go to add this log, if it doesn't match, if the length of this one is not the same as these two combined, you know you need to adjust your seam allowance. So we spend a lot of time talking about that perfect 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch. And it really, yes, it's important that you sew an accurate 1/4 inch, but what really matters is if your finished units are coming out to be the size they're supposed to be. If they're coming out to be too large, then your seam allowance is too narrow. And if they're coming out to be too small, then your seam allowance is too wide. So each round that you add, you will be able to tell, oh, do I need to adjust my seam allowance so that this log matches these two combined. So then when you add this one, I'll move that over just a tad, this one needs to be the same length as these two combined. And you can see as you go around each time, that keeps you honest and allows you to have your block turn out accurately at just the size it should. So these are 12-inch finished blocks, which means they'll be 12 inches, 12 and a half inches with the seam allowance when you're finished making just the block. I want to show you another thing about a log cabin. Another way that you can make a log cabin. So here I have the beginning patch. And with this method, you don't have to cut each log to the perfect length. You just sew this on here and open it up and press it, and then you trim this off even. And let me add a little pin here. So then the same thing with the next strip. This is trimmed. So now I can either add it here or here, depending if I'm going counterclockwise or clockwise. But I sew this one on. You can see there's extra. I'll open it up and press, and then I'll trim. Now, this is a little more convenient, but the problem is that if you're not an experienced sewer, if you're just a beginner, you can run into problems if things aren't just going perfectly. And we know that with fabric, things rarely go perfectly. But in some cases, this is a more convenient method, I would say. And then I want to tell you one other trick. If you make a block and you see that things, when you get to about here, the second to the last round, there's a trick that you can do to make it come out to be the right size. You can cut your last rounds a little bit wider than the pattern calls for. So I exaggerated the width of the strip just for illustration. So I'd add this very last strip to the sides, and then because it's a little bit wider, I've bought myself some wiggle room, and then I can trim the whole block up to be 12.5 inches, which is what it needs to be to fit nicely into the quilt. Now, this will work great for this little sampler quilt we're doing. I don't recommend this if you're doing 100 log cabin blocks and they all need to fit together perfectly. But for our sampler quilt, this is a little trick that will buy you some wiggle room in case you need it. Now let's talk a little bit about fabric. Everyone's favorite topic, right? This was the very first block I made in preparation for today's event. And I was excited about it. I thought it was going to be really great. I put slightly darker fabrics on one side and lighter fabrics on the other. But do you see what I was disappointed about? The center patch doesn't have any contrast with my first 2 logs. So it kind of just gets mushy right there and it blends together. So that is a little tip that you'll find useful no matter what you're making. I am always striving to have contrast between the fabrics in a quilt. I want every fabric to contrast in some way with its neighbors. I want it to look different from its neighbors because that keeps my eye interested. It creates a reason to keep looking at the block. So I learned that I didn't really care for this busy fabric next to this red. So I played around a little bit, and I thought what I'd do today is show you some other options and show you how they change the block. So I think this would be a pretty dynamite little center if I did really bright yellows. That's kind of a school bus yellow. Here's a lighter yellow. I actually think that's pretty good. Like that a lot. These I cut to be the finished size of this patch so you could get a real visual. How about just a blue? Nice, just a regular old blue. I sort of like that one. And it's pretty easy to get really excited about blocks when you just play around like this. Then I thought, well, what if I did white? And I don't really love that. I don't think it adds much punch to the block. I'm always looking for a way to add punch, and I don't think that really does it. Here's sort of an old-fashioned, looks like something that might have come off your grandma's apron. That's probably not my favorite. And then I tried this little block. This is a 30s reproduction. And even though I was using really light and flowery prints, I really kind of liked the way that looked. 30s fabrics or florals, they can get really mushy and not be very interesting if you don't have some really darks in there mixed right in. So I ended up really liking this one, and I made a few blocks with that as the center. So as I played, I just want to point out here, this one is just like the instructions for Awash with color, where you add the first log, the second, and so on. So you are going in a counterclockwise manner. But as I played, I came up with a couple of different things, and I decided that I wanted to try a variation which is called Courthouse Steps. So Courthouse Steps is really just a variation of log cabin, and in Courthouse Steps you add a log to each side of the center, and then you press, and then you add a log to the top and the bottom. And there are different ways you can do it. You can make these 2 of one fabric and these 2 of a different fabric. But I played around enough that I decided I wanted them in rounds. So I wanted this whole set of 4 to be the same fabric. So then I ran into some problems because I was cutting up 10-inch squares, popularly known as layer cakes. And I thought, you know, this would be a good opportunity to show you a couple of ways to cope if your strips aren't quite long enough. So you can see this is 10 inches long. It's going to be long enough for the first 2 logs, top and bottom, but it's not going to be let's see, the first 2 logs would be on the sides. So it would be long enough to do these 2 logs, but then when I have to go all the way across this, plus each log on the side, it won't be long enough. So I thought I would show you a couple of ways to cope with that. And one of the ways you can cope is by doing a partial seam. So I take my strip and I'll add it to one of the sides, and I'll start it even with the raw edges here, sew down and stop before I get to the other end. You see I've left that open. So then what happens is I come with my next strip and I sew it here. I'm going to sew this onto here, and then I can cut this one off, and then I'll sew my next one and cut it off. And then my final strip will go here, because remember I'll have a strip here, and I'll sew this here, and I'll trim this off even. So I'll fold that under to indicate that. Then I can take this very first seam that I sewed and complete that seam. So that's what's called the partial seam, is this first one we sewed, but it allows you to set something in to a unit without ever sewing a Y seam or anything like that. And in this case, what the partial seam did for us was it let us use shorter strips, and we didn't run into any problems that they weren't long enough. One other thing that I would show you about, I guess I forgot, I actually had a sample made so that I could show you. So here's where I did my partial, added the next log, added the next log, and so then here's where my very last one will go. There, and I would trim it off here even, and then you can see I have plenty of space. So there's the idea. So one other easy solution, if that should happen to you, is that you can just take 2 of those strips and you place them at right angles to each other, and then you're going to sew from where they intersect here straight across down to where they intersect here, and then trim this off so that you have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and press it open, and magically you have a strip that's plenty long to go around your block. So that's another easy little way of coping with strips that might not be long enough. So then I played with a few other things. I thought, well, if I'm going to do this courthouse steps idea, I started with my dark, and then I added a light print and a little bit darker print and finished up with a light. And I sort of like the way that looks. I think that would be a really fun and interesting quilt. And here you can see that I had my seams, my diagonal seams. And when you have lots of blocks sewn in and the whole thing is quilted, no one will ever notice that there's a little seam right there. So that I would not let that bother me at all. If you look at vintage and antique quilts, they're full of places where she ran out of fabric or she attached another strip to make it long enough. Quilting has a long history of sewing something onto it to make it work. So that's one of my little courthouse steps ideas. And then this idea Oh my goodness, I am so excited about this. I thought, okay, what if I use white in every other round? So started with that same dark in the center, then added red. So again, this is Courthouse steps, and you add 2 logs to the sides and then a log to the top and the bottom, and you just keep going, 1 on each side, 1 on the top and the bottom, all the way through. And I just love the way this looked. But let me tell you, when I got really excited is when I realized that I could make half the blocks like this, and the other half I could make them the center plus white print white. And oh my goodness, when you start putting them together and use some bright, happy colors, this is kind of the look that I ended up with. And I am so excited about this little possibility. I can hardly wait to start making these blocks. So a little later today, I will put up instructions for how to do the Courthouse Steps version, and you can give that a try if you like. So I really would encourage you to jump on in with the Awash with Color Mystery Sampler Quilt. The parts are actually all posted because it was a mystery a while back, so you can see exactly what it looks like. The supply list you will find, it says 4 to 5 yards of a background, and then lots and lots of fat quarters and scraps. I'm not picking any one particular background. I'm going to pull things from my stash and make decisions as I go, which is actually the most fun and I think the most effective way to build a scrap quilt. And a sampler holds your interest the whole time because every block is a new adventure. So I see that we've added the links to block number 1, so I hope you'll check that out. I'm really looking forward to making this quilt, and I hope lots of you will join in. And I'm Diane. I'm with Stash Bandit, which is my little business. So you can find me online at stashbandit.net. I'd invite you there for more tips and tricks, blog giveaways, interesting scrappy quilts, and lots more fun. Let's see, on Instagram, I'm at Stash Bandit Quilting, and I put a lot of things I'm working up there. I'd love to have you join me there. Be sure to like and follow Annie's and Quilter's World here on Facebook and on Instagram so that you never miss out on all of the fun. And I will look forward to seeing you next time, and I hope you'll jump in with me on the Awash with Color Mystery Sampler. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'll see you again next time. Take good care.